І ще раз добрий вечір. Ми раді всіх вітаць на фестывалі інтэлектуальнай кнігі Pradmova, і гэта наш апошні на сёння івент. Размова з даследчыцай, вядомай даследчыцай Marci Shore. Гэта размова будзе весціся далей па-англійску, але вы зможаце пабачыць відэа з перакладзе на беларускую мову заўтра на нашым YouTube-канале. Таму, калі у вас няма праблем з мовай, то далей слухайце нас свабодна. Калі ёсць пытанні, то тады паслухайце нас заўтра. Ну а таксама на гэтай трансляцыі вы можете задаць свае пытанні ў каментарах унізе ці праз бяспечную Google форму. So, Marci, I'm happy to see you at our online event, and you are the well-known researcher to have some introduction to your position and role in contemporary intellectual discussions. But of course, I'm very happy that you are the guest of our festival.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And hopefully on another occasion, we will be meeting in person in free Belarus.
Okay, it would be great to be so. Now we could discuss the main topics of your investigations, of your interests for maybe last 10 or more years. And let's start from your book, Caviar and Ashes. It was a generation's life and death in Marxism, 1918-1968. 50 years. This book is your first famous book that won 8 awards and was shortlisted for several more. And its main topic is the life strategies and tragic fates of Polish, Jewish, and evidently partly Belarusian or Lithuanian writers and public intellectuals of interwar and post-war Warsaw. Do you see some marks of similarity between that time and ours? And what was the Marxism for those people? A dream for justice and solidarity, a tool for modernizing their society, or some sort of religion? Do we have only ashes of their life, dreams and beliefs? And were they gone with the wind of changes as well as the leftist project itself? Or that is a part of our current world?
Okay, that's a lot of questions. That's, that's the whole 20th century and into the 21st century. What captivated me, or what I was trying to grasp in that book, and to a certain extent what I've tried to grasp in all my work, is the relationship between ideas and experience. So the relationship between the seduction of Marxism as an idea, as a philosophy, as an ideology, and the experience of living Marxism. Now, Miłosz talks about the ukończenie Hegelowskie, the kind of the Hegelian bite. And I was interested in what it was that so captivated people across so much of the globe for so long. Maybe I'll start with a little anecdote. So when I finished the first draft of that book, which was my dissertation, and I graduated from Stanford, and I was in New York, and I was about to leave for my first teaching job at Indiana University. And I had a conversation with my late friend, Tony Judt, who was one of the great historians of Europe. And I asked him, for advice about teaching, because it was my first teaching job. This was 2002, was New York after September 11th. And he said, Marci, when I started university and when I started teaching in the late 60s and the 70s, all of the students wanted to know one thing. How did it go so wrong? How did an idea that was so brilliant and so beautiful turn out to be such a catastrophe? He said, you're going to have a very different kind of challenge. You're going to go into a classroom in the 21st century, and you're going to face students who will want to know how anyone could have been so stupid as to believe in such a ridiculous idea in the first place. He said, and your first challenge is going to be to help them make that imaginative leap and see what was so extraordinarily seductive to so many people in so many places for so long. And until they can make that leap, and until they can see what was so compelling and what grabbed people, what people were willing to devote their lives to and give their lives for, nothing else that happens in the 20th century is going to make any sense. And that was one of the most useful pieces of advice about teaching I ever got. And in some sense, that was what I was trying to do in this book. I was trying to see these were very, very smart people. These were people functioning, in a very cosmopolitan way across multiple languages, and multiple traditions, people who were extremely well-read, extremely well-educated, who did a lot of thinking, and they were caught up in this, and they were willing to give their lives for it. So I was interested in that as an idea, what captivated people intellectually. But then I also wanted to know, what did it mean to live it? What was that lived experience? What did it mean to go through one's life kind of in your own skin as part of that experiment? Which, the other thing I now find myself telling American students when we talk about the Soviet period is that the Soviet experiment was arguably the largest, deepest, most far-reaching experiment in social engineering ever performed on man. And we're still grappling with the enormity of the experiment and the enormity of the catastrophe, the enormity of the failure, the sheer scale of it. And so through the lives of these, somewhat quirky and self-absorbed and artistic, talented, but also somewhat crazy poets, I wanted to try to capture some of that.
Okay, and who was the favorite personality for you from this time?
Oh, from the beginning to the end, I think I felt closest to Alexander Watt.
Mm-hmm.
But I also went through phases of both getting angry at and coming to appreciate more and more Władysław Broniewski, Bruno Jaszensky, Anatol Storn, Witold Wondorski, who is a tragic figure in many ways. Watt was the one whose poetry I felt closest to. And I think part of it is that he was the one who was most self-reflective about his sense of guilt. And he was never able to come to terms with the guilt. And there was almost a kind of narcissistic self-absorption with the guilt, which I somehow related to.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and the last question about this book: what was the difference between before war and post-war period of this intellectual life and searches of such intellectuals? Other tragedy of Holocaust and other tragedies of Second World War very influential for this generation.
Yes, and that's something I've been thinking about a lot now with our current war in Ukraine, because wars they're breaks in time, among other things. They're tears in time and space. The experience of time and space is altered. And it's almost like you can feel one temporality ripping apart. And when I started this project, I had originally, when I began graduate school, I wanted to work on post-war history. And I found myself continually drawn into the interwar years. And I think one of the reasons I fell in love with the 1920s One of the things I loved about the 1920s is that it was a very different kind of post-war from the 1940s. You know, the First World War saw one Europe go up in flames. You know, four great empires fall. You have the Ottoman Empire, the German Empire, the Tsarist Empire, the Habsburg Empire. The whole map of Europe is redrawn. It's a scale of violence against civilians that was previously inconceivable, and we have now tragically become accustomed to. But there was a sense that one world had just gone up in flames. Nobody knew yet what the Bolshevik Revolution was, except that it was a great conflagration, a great fire, and a world was going up in flames. And then the 1920s were this moment of infinite possibilities and a total lack of grounding. You know, and it was when I try to describe it now to my American students, well, not only American students, I mean, I bet maybe 30% of my American students are not actually American, but my students in America, let's say, I use the analogy of maybe, I don't know whether we only have these in America, but the ride at the amusement parks that just kind of drops you from some kind of height. Now, let me just clarify by saying I have never, ever been on such a ride. I never intend on going such a ride. I'm a coward. I don't go on amusement park rides. But that sense of free fall, the thrill of it, that there's infinite empty space and nothing to ground you, which is both thrilling and terrifying. And the 1920s, there was something kind of nihilistic about it, but not in a catastrophic way. You know, more in a sense of, you know, all that is solid melts into air. There's no grounding, like when Lev Shestov talks about, you know, bezpochvanosti, it's that kind of total lack of grounding. And so everything was possible, you know, and this kind of exhilarating impossibilities. And this was the context for these avant-garde poets who were playing with words as if they were things, they were like toys. When Khlebnikov and Kruchonik were talking about the slova kak takovoya, the word as such, you were severing the word from the referent, the signifier from the signified. And so that words became like things, like toys. You could do what you wanted with them. There was a total unhinging, and that was both thrilling and terrifying. And that those possibilities of the 1920s, like that the ecstasy and the terror of it was historically kind of fascinating. You don't see that. And the 1940s were not, 1945 is not ecstasy and terror. If anything, it's just terror. And there's the ecstasy that is left in the rebuilding of communism is not of that same open possibilities. There was the 1930s, you kind of shift into a minor key, and the catastrophism of Miłosz's generation, I think, was very distinct from the nihilism of Watt and Broniewski's generation. The nihilism of Watt and Broniewski's generation in the 20s was nihilism as empty space, as everything was possible and nothing was grounded. By the time you get to the 30s, you really have this feeling of Poland being in between Nazism on one side and Stalinism on the other side. And that feeling, I think, carries over into the post-war years. There's a kind of desperation that's no longer a free space in the 40s and 50s. But there's terror, but it's not the same kind of terror. It's not that terror of emptiness. It's not that terror of radical freedom.
Mm-hmm. By the way, do your American students have some interest in this time and region? And is the history of Europe in some manner instructive for American society?
Well, I would answer yes, but I'm not in an objective position to answer that question, because this is what I teach, right? I'm a Europeanist. I teach European intellectual history at Yale. And so all of the students who come to my classes are very interested, but I wouldn't claim they're a representative sample of American students, but they're the ones who are most real to me because they're the ones I interact with every day. So from my point of view, there's a tremendous amount of interest because I'm always surrounded by that interest. If you were to take a survey of all American students, it's not clear to me what percentage you would get. I definitely feel like there were certain turning points where things were happening both in America and other places in the world where this generation of students began to make connections. Like when I first taught Peter Pomerantsev's book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, about Putin's Russia, I taught it to a small seminar of students in 2015 who saw it as a window into an exotic and very far away place. When I taught it again 2 years later, when Trump had become president, I was teaching it to American students who felt like they were reading about themselves and what was happening in America and this unhinging from empirical truth. And last spring, I taught a seminar on the philosophy of dissent in Eastern Europe. And I had 4 students from China in that seminar. And I think 3 of the 4 were actually not Chinese American, but like from China, going back to China. One of them was only at Yale first semester. And they were reading about what was happening, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia in the 70s and 80s, in Ukraine, in Belarus now, trying to understand their own experience and possibilities for revolution in China. So I think there are definitely, one of our jobs as educators is to help students make connections. I spend a lot of time talking about the possibility and impossibility, or the uses and disadvantages of comparisons, of historical comparisons. I co-curated a forum on this topic, which your listeners can pull up on Eurozine and Public Seminar. And what I tell the students is that there are never any 2 historical situations that are exactly the same, just like there are no 2 human beings that are exactly the same. But that doesn't mean that we can't use comparisons as hermeneutic devices, as interpretive devices, as tools to help us process and understand what's happening in the world. And so I talk about comparison, I talk about metaphor, I talk about translation. We never have transparency, but we can get deeper and deeper understanding.
Thank you very much, and it is very important task as for me. Your next great book, The Taste of Ashes. Ashes one more. It's a very strong metaphor for you, isn't it?
Yes, probably too much ashes. I was probably too obsessed with the ashes.
Okay, this book is about communist and Nazi past in the present of Eastern Europe. That is also some practice in memory studies and intellectual history. We were living under the shadow of these great and horrific narratives for many years, but our presence is still under the pressure of their style in some manner. We discuss the necessity of decolonizing the collective memory and history of the people of Eastern Europe, especially Belarusians, because Ukrainians have started this process earlier than we. But what kind of traumas and other marks of the hard past should we rediscover and elaborate to open another future free of violence and pain?
These are big questions. If I had really good answers to these questions, I could just save everybody and we could move on. Now, recently, in the past, year and a half, in the past 2 years, I've heard a lot more about intergenerational trauma. In the 90s, that was not really a phrase that came up, intergenerational trauma. But in some ways, that was what the book was about. And it was about how, part of it, the point of departure was in some sense my own naivete, because I was 17 in 1989, and I was completely captivated by the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Iron Curtain. And I saw it initially as a kind of Wizard of Oz, ding dong, the witch is dead moment. The Wicked Witch is dead, and now we all live happily ever after. And that was the moment at which I was coming of age, because I was at university in the early 1990s. And there was this sense of triumphalism. There was a sense of victory, of the end of history, now we all know we're moving inevitably towards liberal democracy and we'll all live happily ever after. And then I came to the part of the world that had lived under communism, and I saw that it wasn't that easy. That it wasn't that easy to say, okay, the wicked witch is dead and now we're free. And I started seeing it less as a Wizard of Oz metaphor, and more as a kind of Freudian metaphor. For Freud, the unconscious is like a dark psychic closet in which everything that is too disturbing for the conscious mind is shoved. And so it gets increasingly populated and increasingly dense over the course of a lifetime. And when I first started coming to Eastern Europe, the first word I learned in Czech, which was the first Slavic language I learned, was pravda, was truth. And I had this idea as a young aspiring historian that now the archives were going to be open and we would all bask in the light of truth. We would all celebrate truth. We would all be liberated by truth. But gradually, as I got into those archives, which was voyeuristically fascinating, and like the temptation of becoming a historian of Eastern Europe in the 90s was you could be the first person getting in to see some of these things. And I loved that. That was addictive. But that the opening of these archives, and the opening of these discussions was not actually, like, let's have all the elves sing happy songs and Wizard of Oz kind of moment, that actually it was like the Freudian unconscious. Everything too disturbing to see the light of day had been shoved into those archives. And what Freud understood is that when you start coaxing the contents of that dark psychic closet into consciousness, it might be healthy, but it's not going to be pleasant. It's going to be enormously painful, and very traumatic. And you're going to have to look things in the eye that there are good reasons you had repressed in your unconscious because they were too painful to deal with. And I came increasingly to an appreciation of that people made choices, under the communist period. People made choices under Nazism and communism in inhuman circumstances, or you might say, to quote Nietzsche, all too human circumstances, because we know this is what human beings are capable of, and we now see it every day more and more. They made choices in just impossibly difficult circumstances, in which at moments when there were no innocent choices, at moments when anything you chose was going to cause suffering to someone or something, was going to be a betrayal of someone or something, and now to have to look back on that and account for that in a world in which all the rules have changed could only possibly be agonizing, and of course people were going to look for scapegoats, and of course people were going to look for ways to flee from that knowledge and flee from things that are too painful. But I think Freud was right. I sound like an unrepentant Freudian here, but there is something to the return of the repressed. It keeps coming back. Sergei Lebedev has been kind of fearless about insisting that at the heart of the pathology that is current Russian society is a failure to confront the crimes of the past. That you have to, as wrenching as it is, you have to somehow look that in the face and work through that, or nobody has a chance. And this is certainly a moment where anything that had been repressed through the 90s is now coming back to haunt us.
Okay, thank you. My next question is maybe some provocative, but for many years we are thinking that we are completely free of any sign of Nazism. because of Soviet people as people who were victorians in the Second World War, victorians against Nazism, are completely immune from this ideology. But what we see now in Putin's Russia, for example, it's completely Nazism in its initial form, with all these symbols of that and how and other signs of some visual Nazist symbolics and evidently Nazist practices, social practices. And why just it happens? Why just things could be with people who are maybe the most victims of such ideology in the past?
Well, I would first say that it's not, in some sense, it's historically not that surprising. There's no special immunity that you get from having been a victim or from your grandparents having been victims. It's also the case that historically things, reappear in altered forms. So people look at Putin's Russia and say, oh, there's these things that resemble, these elements that resemble Nazism, these elements that resemble Stalinism, these elements that are new, that are postmodern, that seem to resemble more kind of taking apart of any ontological possibility of a stable truth. All of those things kind of mixed together. I was talking to my daughter, who a while ago, and she keeps asking the kids always ask why, right? They always ask why, like, why is Putin able to manipulate people like this? Why is he making Russians believe that they want to kill Ukrainians? Like, why do they listen to him? Like, why would they believe that? That doesn't make any sense. And I said that, well, historians understand a lot about how these processes work, and how people are drawn into fascism and how they're drawn into totalitarianism. But unfortunately, we have not come up with a magic pill to make it stop. And my daughter, Talia, child of the pandemic, says, well, we need a vaccination against manipulation. I said, yes, we need a vaccination against manipulation. The best we have is education. We go back to Arendt, like, you have to think. You have to ask yourself questions. You have to constantly ask yourself questions. And the ways in which Putin has manipulated this population, and the population has allowed itself to be manipulated, there are elements that are Nazi-like. There are tropes that are Nazi-like. There are also things that are kind of quite different. I don't think there's that much. He's been much better at demobilizing than he has been at mobilizing. I mean, I think for me, the most interesting question, kind of as someone who works on intellectual history, is how has this population been drained of subjectivity so that they don't feel a sense of their own agency and responsibility? And yeah, and this is the question we're all grappling with. I'm sure I have no answers you haven't thought of yourself.
Okay, so we evidently need some process of decommunization, or maybe de-Stalinization in some manner. But we have some examples, for example, Ukrainian way of decommunization. How could you evaluate these processes in the contemporary Ukraine with this movement of decommunization? And what steps do we need as Belarusian society to have such vaccination against our past that could be our future if we don't immune them?
Well, I'm one of the things my suspicion, looking at the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, is that what is so threatening, to Putin's Russia, about Ukraine, watching it for the past 10 or 15 years, is not that Ukrainians have their own language, they have their own poetry, they have their own culture, that they're different, that they're so different, but precisely that in some ways they are so similar, yet they have chosen a radically different path. I think this is the threat. This was the threat of the Maidan. The threat of the Maidan was that it could happen in Russia, that you also have, a place that had gone through this Soviet experience. And for Eastern Ukraine went through the whole Soviet experience, because for Western Ukraine went through, some decades fewer of that experience, but still a place that's gone through the Soviet experience, a place where they also speak native Russian, a place where they have also been mired in post-Soviet corruption and kleptocratic oligarchy, a place where there are many very similar conditions, where many people have gone back and forth, there are many families on both sides of the border, and yet this is a society that has chosen a radically different path. This is a society that has changed tremendously. This is a society that has gained a sense of its own agency, and so the threat, I think, to Putin is precisely that similarity. If it can happen in Ukraine, couldn't it happen in Russia? And I'm definitely not the first person to have noticed that. And what's remarkable to me about Ukraine, is how much it's changed. It's not the same country, it was 30 years ago. And that was a process. And it was a contingent process, and it involved, a lot of people making a lot of choices, and a lot of people themselves changing. What captivated me so much about the Maidan was that it wasn't just a political transformation, it was an existential transformation. And that I saw people I knew, friends and colleagues who were changing in front of me. Like, it was like they were existentially changing in front of me, and people were coming into a sense of their own agency in a different way, and I think that the fact that it was contingent should give us all hope. And the fact that it's contingent means that we have that capacity inside of us. And I look at Ukraine and I think, like, these are people, and this is a generation of people who decided, okay, I don't want to live like this anymore. Now I want to do this, and I'm going to take responsibility. And that's what was so inspiring to me about the Maidan. It was the fact that if that can happen, even if it can happen for a moment, that's a sign that we are capable of it.
And what do you advise us for Belarusian society?
When I was watching again from a distance in August 2020, I thought, wow, like, they've got it. Like, I thought you could, even from, I wasn't even there, but even watching the streaming, you could feel like there was a critical mass of people on the streets. The social contract had been broken. There was a critical mass of people willing to take risks, saying, I don't want to live like this anymore. There was a sense of horizontal solidarity. And there was a sense that, we need a whole paradigm shift. We need not just to, like, replace one guy with another guy, or in this case, we need not just to replace one guy with a woman, but we need a whole paradigm shift in how this society functions and the relationship between the government and the people. And that was incredibly inspiring, and I've been kind of tearing my hair out of that, because for me also, the nonviolence was inspiring, and now we're kind of grappling with, well, if Belarusians had used violence, would they have won? Because you know much better than I do. I mean, you were defeated with sheer violence. I mean, there wasn't a sense that, that, oh, well, too many people really love Lukashenko. I didn't get the feeling anyone really loved Lukashenko. When those workers were shouting, Uhadi, Uhadi, I thought, it's over. It's over. Nobody loves this guy. It's clear who he is. Everybody knows who he is. And people know that he didn't protect them, when the pandemic came. But that, Putin came in and reinforced him with sheer violence, just naked violence. and that nakedness of the violence. So we're just going to have a minority batter the majority with sheer violence, and then what does that mean for the potential of nonviolent resistance? This is still something I'm kind of tearing my hair out about, as someone who spent a lot of my life feeling like a pacifist, considering myself pacifist. And now I go to Washington and plead for Americans to send weapons to Ukrainians.
Okay, thank you very much. And let's turn to the theme of Maidan and your next long read about the contemporary story of us and our region, the Ukrainian Night, an intimate history of revolution, published at 2017. This book is your perception and reflection of a revolutionary society, its dreams and fears of peoples who experienced the Maidan, beginning of Donbas war, tough steps of decommunization and Europeanization processes. So their personal perspective, and you describe that in your characters, Ukrainian writers, artists, intellectuals, as well as ordinary people. So this book was published in English, Polish, Ukrainian, but not in Russian. As I know, this fact disturbs you. And why is it so? Do you believe that this experience could open the eyes of Russians or maybe Belarusian people? Or what should we learn from this Ukrainian lesson? And what insights for Russians and maybe Belarusians could be in the process of reading this book?
Well, I should say it's very possible that my desire to see the book come out in Russian is naive. That the possibility that I could reach Russians when everyone's been trying to reach the Russians and failing time and time again. This may be a very kind of naive, idealistic gesture. And I continually feel like, but we have to keep trying, we have to keep trying. And maybe sometimes somebody from the outside can get to somebody from a side angle, in a way that, that the people who are closer to those recipients haven't necessarily gotten to them. But it's also very possible that it's just a kind of naive attempt. For me, that story was, it was about what subjectivity meant. It was about what it meant to be a subject and not an object. It was about what it meant to take responsibility. And to a large extent, it was not my revolution. I was just an observer. I mean, this is a book really, about my friends and colleagues, and the friends and colleagues of my friends and colleagues. And it was only their generosity that allowed me to tell these stories. And my original idea, I was originally not thinking about Russians at all. In fact, in some sense, I was thinking above all about Germans. It's perhaps strangely enough when I wrote this, because I was in Vienna at the time, the year of the Maidan. And so I was following the news in Russian and Polish and German and English, more in German than I would have been if I didn't happen to be in Vienna at the moment. But I also saw that for my Ukrainian friends and colleagues, the German reception in some ways was the reception that mattered the most, because this was a revolution that had begun, as an attempt to reach Europe, an insistence that this was a European country and Europe should be open, and so it was, and Germany was the central actor, the European Union. And what I felt being in Vienna at the time was that the Austrians and the Germans were sympathetic to the Maidan, but often a little bit condescending, I would say, or patronizing. Or I remember there was one article that talked about the kids in Kiev, and my friend, the wonderful Austrian author and translator Martin Polak, was just furious. He was furious. He's like, the kids in Kiev, these people are giving their lives, the kids in Kiev, like, and they're talking about them like, oh, isn't that nice? Or isn't that cute? Or isn't that sweet? Whereas in Polish, the Poles were using the phrase powstańcy. Powstańcy is a kind of sacred word in Polish, like the insurrectionaries, those who fight, za wolność naszą i waszą. And that discrepancy following in the news in Polish and in German kind of made me feel that maybe there's some role I could play as an American, as a bridge to the Germans. And so actually, originally that book got started as a long essay that was published in German. I didn't write it in German, but that was published in German translation. And it only kind of later became a book. And then I started thinking, how can I explain this experience to Americans? So then I was really thinking about an English speaking audience and how can I get them to understand. I wanted to do a couple things. Like I wanted to, because I fell in love with this revolution, I wanted to share that, but I also wanted to see, and you'll understand this because you're a philosopher, I was working on a book about phenomenology at the time, which I'm still trying to finish. And from a phenomenological point of view, through intense description of something very particular, of the particular thing given to individual subjectivity, would it also be possible to extract a universal essence? Could you also perform a kind of, eidetic reduction in Husserlian terms? Was there some element of revolution that had a universality to it? So that was the other thing I was trying to do. And one of the most moving moments I had when I was giving book talks was at a bookstore in Boston, near Harvard. And there was a woman who was listening and she was crying, and she came up to me afterwards and was asking me about the book. And I asked her if she was from that part of the world, and she said, no, but I'm Egyptian. And I was there during the Arab Spring, and I took part in that revolution. And this was how I felt, that you're describing how I felt this, through all these very different circumstances. And it was a revelation of a human capacity that we rarely encounter. But the fact that it can appear even for an Augenblick, even for a flicker of a second, is our evidence and our reassurance that we have that capacity in us, that we are capable of something better. I should say this is what I clung to in Belarus too. This is why, as I clung to this kind of feminist revolution in Belarus. I'm like, yes, you need to take a model of strength that had been connected with vertical abuse, and you need to replace it with a model of strength that's connected with horizontal solidarity and caring for one another. And if human beings are capable of that, then that should be the light for all of us. That should be where we're going. Why can't we go there? Why does it always have to be like the very worst of us that is coming out in history? Couldn't we go to a place that's better? Couldn't we somehow bring out what's best in us? And the Maidan was a moment where what was best in people was being brought out.
Okay. And what was the most significant insight from this experience of Maidan and post-Maidan Ukrainian society for you as researcher?
There was for me as an intellectual historian, it was the moment when ideas became real again. Because I had fallen in love with Eastern Europe through reading the literature of the dissidents. And what captivated me, about this language of pravda and svědomí and, vědomí and, the consciousness and being and truth and living in truth, what I was so taken by is that these were ideas that weren't only spoken about in a kind of academic way, the way we spoke about them in America, but people were really willing to live these ideas. It was a moment when philosophy was something not only to be learned, but also to be lived. And that's where I wanted to go. That's why I loved that tradition. I felt like America had professional academics and people at universities, but this idea that truth was something you lived in, that you kind of gave yourself for. I was in love with that. But precisely at the time I came to Eastern Europe and started studying that, it went away. Then you had neoliberalism and the free market and economic transition, and nobody was any longer interested in the relationship between being and consciousness, and does being perceive consciousness, or does consciousness perceive being, or what is the relationship between, responsibility and truth, and like that all went away. And for me, the Maidan was a moment when suddenly that was there again. Suddenly, like, podmiotowność in Polish, subjectivity, that was a word. I mean, that was a concept in solidarity. And when the Maidan happened, a Polish friend of mine, a historian, said, well, Marci, podmiotowność, I haven't heard that word since the time of solidarity. And then there it was again, like what it meant to be a subject, to take responsibility for truth. What did truth mean? Like there it was again, and people were living it, and I wanted to show that. And I was fascinated also by what happened as a historian, what happens to temporality, at moments of historical extremity, what happens to time during revolution. Is one of the first things I had noticed anecdotally was that the people I knew there kept mentioning how something strange was happening with time. Suddenly they couldn't remember whether something happened an hour ago or the day before or a week ago. Like the whole experience, like the difference between night and day became effaced. You could now call somebody at any time of the day. Time takes on a different form at these moments of extremity. And so I also became very interested in the philosophy of time. I subjected all of my students to a lot of philosophy of time. We read Husserl, we read Heidegger, we read Bergson, we read Sartre. Everybody had to think about the meaning of time. And I was very interested also in this Sartre's idea of that the present is always a problem for philosophers, right? Because there's no way to grasp the present. The present precisely is what has no duration. It's always inflected by protension and retention, in Husserl's sense, by anticipation, by memory. It has no length. You can't hold on to it. I also harassed my physicist brother-in-law to talk about time. He works on fusion and clean energy. And he said, okay, Marci, in physics, we talk about t equals 0, time equals 0, but it's purely a theoretical concept. I mean, in reality, the present doesn't exist. There's no way, as soon as you try to catch it, it's already the past. And so I was interested in how the present as this border between what Sartre calls the en soi and the pour soi, the in itself and the for itself, or facticity and transcendence, what has been and cannot be changed, and the possibility to go beyond. The present is that border. And that border is with us every moment of all of our lives, but we normally don't see it. We don't notice it. We don't really experience it. And suddenly watching the Maidan, you saw that the present as that border between facticity and transcendence, between who you have been and the possibility to go beyond. It was like you suddenly cast a spotlight on it. And everybody was kind of jolted into an awareness of what the present was. And that was extraordinary. Even from a distance, that was an extraordinary thing to watch.
Oh, thank you. So let's go to another side of your character as intellectual historian. You are well known as well as researcher of Jewish legacy. Jewish intellectual legacy of Eastern Europe, and maybe we could discuss this problem. Now all we are witnesses of the current tragedy in Israel and the very the signs of new possible war at the Far East, and nevertheless, what should we do with our Jewish legacy, with our past about Jewish culture and Jewish intellectuals, artists, writers, and so on, who were the part of our identity in some manner for Belarusians, for Ukrainians, for Polish people too. What kind of politics of commemoration or other steps should we do to have this memory about our mutual past and about our mutual cultural legacy?
That's also a very big question. I should first of all say I have dealt a lot with questions about Jewish history in Eastern Europe, but I don't work in Jewish languages. I studied Yiddish for a time, and I used some Yiddish sources years ago, but I haven't worked in Yiddish since then. And I don't speak Hebrew and I don't speak Arabic, and so I'm very conscious of not being the right person.
Maybe Yiddish.
Maybe, but Yiddish I learned better, but also because I learned German, and the Yiddish has a lot of Slavic, that there was a time when I was working with more Yiddish sources, but I don't consider myself an expert on Jewish history per se. I went to Israel for the first time as a teenager in 1989. And at that time I thought of it, I understood it as a Middle Eastern country. And then when I went back in the 90s, from the point of view of living in Warsaw, I understood it as an East European country. I understood it in a completely different way. I should first say that my entry point, is always, as being a kind of, bezrodny cosmopolite, myself, and so my impulse is always to be very skeptical of attempts to kind of reify the borders of these different communities. Years ago, when I was giving, I had a public discussion in Łódź for Krytyka Polityczna with Anya Bikant, who's wonderful. My son Caleb, in fact, I was wearing him in a baby carrier at the time, and he grabbed the microphone from my hand. We were talking about I think the role of intellectuals in 20th century Poland. It was something very general, and among other things about the writers I had written about in Caviar and Ashes, and then the writers that Anya Bikant had written about, in another wonderful book that is the writers who were a generation younger. And a young man came up to me afterwards, a student, kind of left-wing student in Łódź, and said, I have a question, but I was embarrassed to ask, in front of the whole audience. Can I ask you now? And I have this anxiety that maybe the Polish nationalists are right, or maybe the Polish right, the prawica, is like, maybe they do have a point. Maybe all of these philosophies and intellectual traditions that I'm so attracted to and that feel so inspiring to me, maybe they really do come from foreigners. Maybe they really do come from the French or the Jews or the Germans. Like, maybe the things that are authentically Polish, maybe they do belong to the right wing. And maybe I am maybe I'm not really, a Polish intellectual. And my answer to him was that the question was not, that it was the wrong question, because my answer to him was that ideas are always cosmopolitan. They don't respect state borders. They don't respect national borders. There is no such thing as an idea or a philosophy that is articulated by someone who never read anyone else, who never read anyone else, who never read anyone else. We're not even aware of all the ways in which our thinking, is influenced, through infinitely complex syntheses of all of our many interlocutors and the interlocutors of our interlocutors. And so my point of entry, as a historian of intellectual life, was not to fetishize these borders between Poles or Jews or Ukrainians or Belarusians, and to leave space for this fluidity. And so I try to just kind of leave things be. I try to, there are these questions about, well, is somebody a Jew, or are they a Pole, or are they Ukrainian, or are they do we want to do a genealogical analysis? Well, this starts to get kind of Nazi-like when we start to do the genealogical analysis. And then there's the question of, well, is somebody a Jew because they self-identify as a Jew? Is somebody as a Jew because they are perceived as a Jew in the eyes of the other? And this was, and to be perceived as a Jew in the eyes of the other had a particular meaning at times of anti-Semitism. I try not to be heavy-handed about it. I try to kind of leave space for the fact that we inhabit this world in complex ways, and our identities are also kind of complex, and there are elements of them that feel particularly prominent at certain historical junctures that might feel less prominent, or something else might feel more prominent at some other historical juncture or some other situation. Looking at now what's happening, like the relationship between Jews and Ukrainians has been an extraordinary thing to watch. It was from the point, if you were reading Isaac Babel 100 years ago, and somebody told you that in the 21st century you would have a Russian-speaking Jewish comedian accused of being a Ukrainian Nazi, who would step into the role of Winston Churchill, and lead the free world in a fight against tyranny. It's like the layers of historical irony and absurdity would be incomprehensible, and yet kind of here we are. And one thing that's been very moving is seeing as Jews and Ukrainians, like Ukrainians and Poles and communities that really have reasons, in the past to have had tremendous amounts of resentment and harm done to one another, are starting something new, in the sense that Arendt talked about natality. And I like to think there's an element of it that Jan Patočka would describe as the solidarity of the shaken, that those who have had these kind of confrontations with the darkness at the heart of human existence, even if on opposite sides, have a basis to understand one another. And Patočka would say that the solidarity of the shaken is not the solidarity of those who have forgiven and forgotten, but the solidarity of those who understand. It's been incredibly moving for me to see, how Jews and Ukrainians have found a common language, and how Ukrainian Jews have identified, with this particular liberation project. As a historian, I think all of us would say the same thing. Like, if you want to move forward, you have to look at the past with eyes wide open, not so that you can make people atone for the sins and crimes of their grandparents and things that people did before they were born, but so you can understand how it happened and take steps not to let it happen again in the future.
Mm-hmm. So many Ukrainians now, and free Belarusians too, are in solidarity with the modern Jews in their struggle. And how do you think? Is it because of our collective memory, or we think so as representatives of I don't know, free world against some authoritarian or totalitarian impulses? How do you think?
Oh, I'm definitely not the best person to answer that question. It's too fresh, and I know too little. There's a sense of people have experienced terror, and the Ukrainians are experiencing terror, and the Belarusians have experienced terror. And so there's an empathy for terror and the meaning of terror. It's certainly it's a much more complicated situation in the Middle East in many ways than it is in Ukraine. There's no reason, for Russians to be coming to Ukraine and killing Ukrainians. They could just leave and go home at any moment. Israelis have nowhere else to go, and Gazans have nowhere else to go. That's like, and the Palestinians have nowhere else to go. They are at home. They are where they are, and the layers and layers of grievances and harm done to one another are complex in a very, very different way. Watching the horror that's played out there, one of the things that kind of chilled me was, do we become somehow simply habituated to inconceivable cruelty in such a way that we have an immediate impulse to rationalize or politicize it and not give ourselves a moment to just experience the sheer horror of it. And that to me was very important. However one may feel about, Israeli policies towards the Palestinians, which I think have been horrendous in many ways for a very long time, though I'm not an expert. Netanyahu's government has clearly been a Jewish supremacist government and has done tremendous damage in many ways. I'm enormously sympathetic, and in many ways, on the side of Palestinians, but that does not in any way make me rationalize or make me feel like, well, it's okay or it's understandable that terrorists come across the border and they slaughter children in front of their parents. There has to be a kind of, to take pleasure in that is sadistic, to take pleasure in that and to cheer that on, as some people have, that's not a political error, that's a human failure. There's also the very painful irony that a disproportionate number of the Jewish victims, in that southern part of Israel close to Gaza, were precisely the pro-Palestinian peace activists who had devoted themselves to trying to bring peace and to speaking up in Israel for the Palestinians, which in a way that's in a way that's disproportionate, or in a way that like a disproportionate number of those victims because of those kibbutzim that were right there across the border. No, and it's so horrendous, and how it can be resolved. I mean, the question is, one question I keep asking myself as a historian is, Leszek Kolakowski used a phrase, negatywna selekcja, negative selection. Why is it that precisely the very worst people come to power? Why is it the people who have no moral compass, who have no conscience, who are unabashedly opportunistic or narcissistic, why are they disproportionately, in positions of power? And I look at things I look at Hamas, and I look at Netanyahu, and I think, why is it precisely the very worst? Like, why is it like the most damaging elements of both those societies, when there are plenty of people there on both sides who would be very, very capable of living together in some very normal, humane way? But I asked that same question about America. How do we get Trump coming into power? Why is it the pathological narcissist, who have absolutely no conscience, who will happily take children from their parents and toss them in cages on the border? Well, I mean, the percentage of the population in any given population who is a kind of psychopathic lunatic, that must be a marginal percentage of the population. Yet somehow the psychopathic lunatics keep coming to power. And why do they keep kind of getting the upper hand over all the rest of us? In some sense, that's the universal question. Like, why does that keep happening? Why is there this negative selection? It's anti-evolutionary.
So it's really hard questions for discussion, or for some solving them. Okay, before we continue our conversation, I want to engage our audience who sees the stream to be more active. And please write your comments or questions below the stream or through the special Google form to to have some answers from Marci. So, as the next topic, you are the author of many essays and articles about gender and feminist agenda in the modern world. Is the struggle for equality for women actual nowadays in the same manner for the Western and non-Western societies? With the horrific stories of the violence and repressions of women's rights in Iran, Afghanistan, but also in Belarus against armless women and women who are political prisoners, as well as cruel stories of rapes and violence against Ukrainian women in occupied territories. How is to be a female in our times?
Oh, no, this is an excellent question. Well, maybe I will first of all say, now we're kind of living in an age where gender is very fluid and non-binary gender is very accepted. From a historical point of view and from the point of view of war, there's a kind of biological irreducibility that puts women in a position of vulnerability. I mean, women can get pregnant, women can carry children, and men can't. And at moments of historical extremity, that's a particular vulnerability. The vulnerability of women to be raped, the vulnerability of women to be impregnated. And that irreducibility can't really be made to go away. There's a fantastic book by the historian Anya Muller, who is originally from Gdańsk and teaches at University of Michigan. She's my former graduate student, and I'm extremely proud of her. And she wrote a book called If Walls Could Speak, about the experience of Polish women in Stalinist prison in the post-war years. And it's absolutely fearless. So she takes you inside that prison cell with these women, and there are things you can do to women's bodies that you can't do to men's bodies. And she kind of looks that fearlessly, in the eyes, what that means. That obviously doesn't go away in times of war. If anything, it's more present in times of war. One of the things, as I've clung to in Belarus, is this sense that there could be a kind of feminism that would be different from the kind of feminism that in some ways I was taught as I was a young person becoming a historian. When I was in graduate school, there were very few women faculty at the highest positions at American universities. Although by the time we got to my generation, the graduate students were more or less half and half. And so the small number of women senior faculty were trying to advise us, the young women, and the general advice at the time was that you should not do anything that would draw people's attention to gender. Preferable not to have children. If you do have children, you should really have them while you're writing your dissertation so that you're not yet in the public eye and nobody can see you pregnant. You, in any case, should not mention those children. You shouldn't have pictures of them in your office. You should also, not make coffee for anyone or offer to make dinner for them or ask questions about how somebody is feeling or do anything that might be considered kind of nurturing or maternal or caretaking or and that if you do that and you act just like stereotypical male behavior where you're self-interested and self-promoting and you have defeminized yourself, then you have a very good chance of making it because there's a politically correct principle of gender blindness that is now being enforced. And my instinctive feeling at the time, which was not just my feeling, I felt like lots of us who were women graduate students at the 90s had this feeling, was that why should this stereotypically male model of behavior be normative? Like, isn't that really anti-feminist in a certain way? If you assume that the way that stereotypically men behave is the model for everyone and we should all adapt to that. And maybe in fact, that's kind of perverse because maybe that's not the best model. Moreover, if nobody makes coffee, then there's no coffee, which is not a good thing. But maybe this kind of stereotypically maternal feminizing behavior that we're supposed to purge from ourselves, where you actually kind of care for one another in the public sphere a little bit, maybe that's precisely what the public sphere needs more of. Like, maybe that should be the normative model of behavior. Maybe we should be importing that as opposed to purging that. And what I loved in Belarus was feeling that, finally, that like that feeling I had in the 1990s, now that's become a political principle of revolution. Like, now that should be normative. Like, the fact that there should just be more caring. There should be more horizontal caring in the public sphere. And that's really, like, for men and women alike, that's really better for everybody, you know. And I feel like that's where feminism has to go. If there's a like sense of there's stereotypically maternal behavior where like you make sure your kids get fed, like, shouldn't we just have more of that as opposed to try to get rid of that? And I still have this kind of desperate hope that that's where things will go. And that sense, like that model in Belarus, that you have to overturn the association of strength with abuse. It can't be real men beat their wives. This whole, bьет значит любить, like, it has to go. It has to go for everybody. Like, it has to be overturned, and it has to be strength is associated with caring for one another. And that's the only way this world has any kind of a chance.
Okay. The next question is about is strongly connected with previous one. You are the well-known researcher with good reputation in academical cycles, but maybe for someone you could be, oh well, she's Timothy Snyder's wife. Is it relics of our masculine history and collective mental attitudes, or what is it? Why feminism or post-feminism, I don't know, is on top of today's life for you?
It's an excellent question. Well, I should first say that, I'm in a very particular situation, right? Because, and Tim, obviously I'm not objective, but he's a very special person. So I don't know that I can generalize from my situation, and the fact that I'm so often his wife. I like being his wife. I love being his wife in many ways. I try not to get overly offended. If I reacted negatively every time and assume that people were not taking me seriously, which I'm sure some of the time they're not taking me seriously, but it would just poison my life. And so I just try to put it aside, because you can't do a control study on your own life. Like, I can't say, well, would I be somehow treated differently, if I were not his wife, or if I pretended not to be his wife, or if I refused to associate with him, or that seems like an impossible situation to me, and so I've kind of just like, I've tried to put that aside as best I can. I've also tried to just put aside the fact that, we have a lot of shared commitments and we have very different styles. We've both been very, very engaged in Ukraine. And we're very different kinds of writers, and we're different kinds of speakers, even as we share a lot of these commitments, and I try to just let that be. We sometimes, give public discussions together, but we never co-author anything. In part because I'm such a control freak about my writing that I never co-author anything with anybody. Like, I like to have control over every word, but it's important to me that I express myself in my own voice and the way I want to express myself. I think we're good readers, of each other's writing, and there are things that Tim is very good at doing that I'm less good at doing. Like, he is much better at like the 5-minute television genre. I'm not very good when I only have 5 minutes. I always feel like I need to tell a story. Tim is very good at saying, this is what you need to know, bam, like, and that's it. okay, just listen to me and now it's over. Whereas I feel like I need to kind of set up the beginning and the middle and the end, and I need to take the listener through a whole kind of storyline so that they followed me. So I feel like I'm much more effective if I have 45 minutes than I am when I have 5 minutes. And Tim is really excellent, especially on television, like when he has 5 minutes. And so we do different things, better, and we connect with different audiences and in different kinds of ways. But yes, I try to just enjoy being his wife as much as I can and not take offense every time I'm called his wife. There was one moment that was quite funny when there was a headline I gave an interview to a Slovak journalist after the horrific murder of that young journalist who was investigating corruption and his girlfriend several years ago. And I said, I was using that line from Heidegger's Der Spiegel interview that only a God can save us now. I said, only the journalist can save us now at this moment of post-truth. Like, we are all dependent on journalists with an actual commitment to empirical reality, and the headline in the Slovak newspaper was something like Manželka Timothy Snydera, like, Timothy Snyder's wife says that only the journalist can save us now, which I found somewhat like as a comical headline. But again, like, I didn't complain about it. Like, there are more important things going on in the world than my, taking offense. So I feel like there are women who are really, really suffering, and I'm not really, really suffering from being Tim's wife.
Okay, thank you for this answers. And before we go to the questions of our audience, my last question for you. Let's discuss your current project and near future plans. What about should be your next great book? What is your professional trigger right now?
Yeah, well, I'm trying to finish finally, belatedly, this very long book about phenomenology, or really about encounters among thinkers connected to phenomenology in Eastern Europe from the late 19th through the 20th century. And it's a project that had been brewing in my mind for decades. I keep getting interrupted by these world historical catastrophes, but I'm hopefully, in the next year or so, going to actually finish this book, which I've been preoccupied with. And it has to do, among other things, with the search for truth. With this question of, is there such a thing as truth, which has been a kind of central theme in East European intellectual life. And so the book begins with the generation of Edmund Husserl and Tomasz Masaryk, and deals with Masaryk. The early sections deal with Masaryk and Husserl and Gustav Spiet and Lev Shestov, and it kind of goes all the way through kind of Havel and Adam Michnik, and in some ways is a kind of story about a path that might not lead to post-truth, but might lead to a return to truth. But it's very biographically driven. So there's a lot of very dense philosophy, but there's also a lot of biographical details. I think you're speaking to me from Poland, so I'll say there's some of the most interesting characters to do with Irena Kranska and Tadeusz Kransky, who are also like largely forgotten, but totally fascinating. Edith Stein plays a central role, as does Jan Patočka and Roman Ingarden. And I've been spending a lot of time communing with Lev Shestov in the later stages of these projects, who's someone I've really fallen in love with over the years. Again, a philosopher who's kind of largely forgotten these days, but who, like with Vat, I feel especially close to him. So yes, hopefully it's a kind of long epic novel type book that goes through several generations and is kind of spread both horizontally and diachronically. But hopefully that is going to happen. Okay.
Do you know probably its future title?
Oh, I keep changing I keep changing the title. At the moment I've been toying with a quote by Vitkazi in a letter to Ingarden, like eyeglasses floating in space, where Vitkazi is criticizing, he's attacking Husserl to Ingarden, saying, you know, Husserl for me is like eyes and glasses with a beard and no body, just floating in space. But we'll see. Like the subtitle is, you know, Central European encounters that came about during the search for truth.
So it should be interesting. The question from Alena Talapila. Dear Marci, speaking of portrayal of Ukrainians in German media, do you feel a marked difference between Maidan and 2022 war? Or is the change slight and there is a lot still to do and change?
I can probably speak better about the American case than the German case, but somewhat to the German case as well. Yes, I think there's a big change. Even if just, I haven't done a systematic study, but from the point of view of like the journalist I talked to or the interviews I've given, in 2014, I think not just myself, but a lot of us who engage with this region, were spending a lot of time, you know, explaining that, you know, that the Maidan was not an American-sponsored conspiracy, that these were not radical nationalists, that these were not Nazis who were going to kill all the native Russian speakers, that this was a distortion, that this was Kremlin propaganda, that there was a lot more of that explaining that was happening. There was really a market shift in 2022. I mean, in February 2022, I mean, for the first couple weeks, I felt like I was just talking to journalists, you know, in different places, sometimes being explicitly interviewed, sometimes just helping put them in touch with friends and colleagues in Ukraine. And it was a much more sophisticated layer of questions. You know, and there was much more, it was the first time where journalists were really, they were spending a lot more time saying, can you talk to me for half an hour, for an hour, and explain to me the background before I go interview someone else. And I think the experience of Trump really made a difference. I think this experiencing of what is post-truth and can you be completely unhinged from empirical reality. Because in 2016, when Trump came on the scene, American journalists were used to fact-checking individual facts. They weren't used to a complete separation from empirical reality. The idea that things could be totally fictitious and just pulled out of the air. By 2022, they were. By 2022, there was much more of a sense of resistance, you know, to the Kremlin narrative. And I think that yes, I would say yes, there's definitely, the Ukrainians, I think, were much more respected sooner. Now, that didn't mean that people thought they had any chance, but there was a kind of respect that I didn't feel in 2014.
Thank you. And the second question, it's a long question, from Yulia Chernyshova. Can we view the happenings of August 2020 as a process, as was described in the discussion of Maidan, of political resistance, which grows into a bigger change, and existential re-evaluation of ways of living and doing things, and restructure of social systems? When people would start doing many, if not all things differently, creating a giant fissure between how it was in the past and how it should be in the future. If so, how do we perceive the afterlife experience of this big transformation? Is this change in society presumably slowly fading away under higher than ever pressure? Or is it preserved within the society and still reproduced while the people are captured in the past of the political system? As if Belarusians got left in this fissure between the past and the future, and how does what you've described as a torn apart, spatially and temporally of the war time, contribute to these processes, if they affect Belarusians too? Many questions. Maybe you could start from the first one about the happenings of August 2020.
Well, you're in a much better position to tell me than I am to tell you. I'm not at all an expert. My historian's intuition is that nothing is for nothing, that nothing just disappears, that something happened, that people changed, and that is still there, and there's something latently brewing. And the fact that that revolution didn't succeed in overthrowing tyranny at that moment, I don't think that means it was for nothing. I feel like it still feels to me somehow kind of from a distance. Again, you're in a much better position to tell me than I am to tell you, but it feels to me like that's still there, that's still brewing, that something is latent, and it will sooner or later, explode again. In what conditions, in what way, one always goes back and thinks like, okay, what happened in 1848, what seemed that history didn't quite turn, but then it did, or what happened in 1905 when it seemed that it didn't quite turn, but then it did. I don't think anything is for nothing. I don't think things just disappear. And I think that you should tell, I think people are different from having gone through that experience.
Maybe the most fear of the free Belarusians now that Lukashenko and his officials could transform Belarus into the East European Northern Korea, with the society without memory, without future, without plans, and without freedom, of course. And maybe this question is about global trends of these processes, social processes. Could some repressions, could some pressure revert this social movement and direct us back to the totalitarian or to the authoritarian system without any hope for changes, for any hope for future, without this violence and repressions?
Anything is possible, but I remain cautiously optimistic, even as a kind of catastrophic neurotic or neurotic catastrophist. I think this war only ends when Ukraine decisively defeats Russia and Putin's regime falls. I think Putin's regime falls and Lukashenko's regime falls. I don't get the sense that Lukashenko's regime, without being backed up with Putin, has anything like the support it needs to keep going. I don't think anybody believes this man. This man, you look at him, you look at his press conference, even to a non-native Russian speaker like me, listening to this guy talk, he's like a clown. Nobody the hold he has seems to me very fragile and could collapse at any moment if you don't have the Kremlin coming in with their money and their weapons. So I keep thinking that at any given moment, it could turn. At any given moment, it could be over. One of the most hopeful things anyone said to me since February 2022 was I was doing a Zoom talk with Oksana Forestina for PEN, and there was a PEN Club official there, a writer from Southeast Asia, who was hosting, and he stayed on the line afterwards and talked to me and Oksana a bit. And he said, and we were both very upset, and she was in Ukraine. I really didn't have a reason to be as upset as she was, but I get upset easily, and I was very upset. And he said, I don't know whether this will make you two feel any better now, but I can tell you from decades of covering events, in Asia, that sometimes a tyrannical regime, seems most stable, and unstoppable 5 minutes before it falls. And and as a historian, I see that point and I now cling to it.
Thank you for this fruitful discussion and this of optimism from your side. And Thank you very much, and I hope we could see you physically next time in Warsaw or maybe in Minsk.
I am very hopeful that next time we will be in Minsk. It's
Thank you,
great to
Marci.
see you. Thank you, Pavel. Take care. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.